So one of the things I've been really curious about in studying Russian history is the concept of the father-czar. During Imperial Russia, there was really this idea that the czar was in a symbolic relationship with the country itself, which was Mother Russia. It was the motherland. It was a feminine word. It had feminine connotations. There was implications to the womb when she was referenced as moist Mother Earth. I know a lot of people have a hard time with that word. I'm sorry, it's the translation. One would think that after the Bolshevik Revolution, that Russia would have fallen away from the father-czar concept, that it would be kind of repulsive to the Russian people. But you see Lenin somewhat took up that mantle, not in directly. He never called himself the father-czar, but his role had those implications. And then Stalin did as well. We are now seeing that also with Putin. He's not fully going into that full stereotype yet, but he seems to be moving in that direction. And so I have wondered why. Why that kind of idea is so pervasive. I mean, especially after the Bloody Sunday Massacre, which is when a group of townspeople and their priest had gone to seek an audience with the Tsar, which, as far as I understand, was a normal practice at the time. The Tsar was not at his palace, and his guardsmen ordered them to be open-fired on. And that sparked a huge wave of protests. And that really diminished the whole father-czar image, even though the Tsar himself directly was not involved in that. He wasn't even there. And I mean, this was 1905, so the Bolshevik Revolution was 1917, 1918, so they still had some time to go prior to the revolution to really deconstruct this idea of the father-czar. Juice is snoring. Anyway, this is a question that I was asking, and I was really curious to figure out why this was the case. And remember, my focus is the authoritarian personality as a trauma response. So I kind of had a nebulous concept of why this might be the case. There's two things here that are really worth considering right off the bat. Firstly, in 1917, the literacy rate for men was 37%, and the rate for women was 12%. This literacy rate was part of a set of Bolshevik statistics that were done around the revolution to figure out where the population was at. And even though I haven't really been able to find a source for this, logic tells me that the people who were most likely to be literate lived in towns. They were not part of the rural population. Serfdom was also a huge thing in Russia, and it persisted for far longer than it did in Western Europe. The final serf emancipation happened in 1861, and that was a third of the population. However, they were terrified of revolution, and so they did emancipation very slowly. In 1800, over half the population was serfs, and at various points in Russian history, it was 90% of the population that was serfs. And serfdom presented a huge problem, not just in terms of individual agency and autonomy, but it severely stunted the Russian economy. You had millions of people who were trapped doing peasant labor in very harsh conditions, and they did not have the opportunity to build up the economy as artisans and craftspeople and do roles outside of that. There was also the issue that every time Russia had a war, each peasant family was responsible for supplying a number of conscripts. Oftentimes this was done through the община, but that's neither here nor there. Basically, the Russian peasant supported the military, the economy, the government in its entirety. And I bet you're sitting here Kate, what does this actually have to do with the father-czar concept? There's a couple of things to that. Firstly, the peasants, because of the horrific nature of their lives, were deeply authoritarian. Terror management theory states that if you remind someone of their own mortality, they are more likely to agree with and support authoritarian views. which does make sense if you want to make the argument that authoritarianism is a primordial response to dealing with danger and dangerous situations. It was about keeping you alive, and it was about keeping you from truly addressing the horrors of your life, because often they were so substantial you would have crumbled under them. They had substantial power dynamics. They knew how to work the authoritarian system. They would very much say one thing to one group and then another thing to a different group, and that makes it really hard to pin down the peasant mindset. And I don't blame them for this. Their lives are absolutely awful. They had to survive. They were also practicing witchcraft, actually, up until the revolution. And witchcraft in peasant society had very strong elements of power and control, and trying to gain power over someone or take away someone else's power. There was a lot going on there. One of the really interesting studies I read was the language that was used in the peasant village after the Bolshevik Revolution. Because what they started doing was sending people out to these villages to teach them about socialism and teach them about all these new things that were coming about. But of course, nobody could read. And they had never even conceived of a concept that was not czardom. And this is incredibly apparent in the conversations that they had and the letters that they wrote in all of their various attempts to understand the situation that they were in. There is so much the peasants want to know but cannot understand. One of the peasants even said, "There are no words to explain the shame and pain that engulf a man when he realizes that even what he has been given to him is too hard for him to understand, and it is like a stone instead of bread." They also had a tendency to conceive of national issues in terms of having local solutions. So, for example, during World War I, they believed that they could just talk things over with the Germans and it would be fine. So they had this very deeply rooted sense of the father-czar. They couldn't really conceptualize a government system where there was not a father-czar type figure at the top. So some of them would say, if you asked them who they were voting for, "Oh, I'm going to vote for the czar." Or they would conceptualize it as like a change of the czar, which is historically what Russia did when the czar pissed them off too much. I'm not talking about Ivan the Terrible. Most of them did not understand socialism or the terms of the revolution because they had never conceived of anything else. They had no ability to read. And therefore, when printed material was disseminated to them, someone else had to read it to them. Sometimes there was a local teacher or the priest or the Bolsheviks sent lecturers and orators through these villages to try and, educate them on these concepts. But that goes back to this idea of informed consent. How can people vote for things that they have no conception of? How can people vote on ideas that are so removed from their daily experience that it just doesn't make sense? Because the thing is, this is not to say the peasants were stupid or the peasants should have been kept out of politics. This is the downstream effects of a multi-century societal failure. So then the perpetuation of the concept of the father-czar under different names is just a symptom of that mass failure.